For more than 7 decades, control of the world's oceans has been the ultimate source of geopolitical power. Whoever commands the seas commands global trade. Whoever controls the choke points controls the flow of energy. And for generations, that power has rested firmly in American hands. But something fundamental is shifting. In May 2025, a fully loaded freight train departed from Xi'an in central China. 15 days later, it arrived at a dry port in Iran, thousands of kilometers away. 2 weeks after that, the same train returned to China, this time carrying 50,000 barrels of Iranian crude oil. This wasn't just another cargo delivery. It was a statement. After 12 years of planning, negotiation, and construction involving 5 nations, China has completed a strategic railway that stretches over 10,000 kilometers across the heart of Asia. And with its opening, Beijing has achieved something the United States never thought possible, a way to bypass the naval choke points that have defined global power for nearly half a century. Today, we're going to explore what this railway really means. How does it work? Why does it matter? And what does it signal about the future of global trade, energy security, and the balance of power between East and West? Let's begin with a place most people have never visited, but one that quietly controls a fifth of the world's energy supply. The choke point that controls the world. Nestled between the Arabian Peninsula and the coast of Iran lies a narrow body of water that barely appears significant on a world map. It's called the Strait of Hormuz. On the western side sits the Persian Gulf, home to some of the largest oil reserves on the planet. On the eastern side lies the Gulf of Oman, which opens into the Arabian Sea and the Indian Ocean beyond. For every country bordering the Persian Gulf, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, and Bahrain, this strait is effectively their only gateway to the rest of the world. The geography here is striking. The strait forms a rough V-shape, and at its narrowest point, it measures less than 30 kilometers across. You could drive that distance in 20 minutes. Yet through this tiny passage flows an enormous portion of the world's energy. According to data from 2024, approximately 20 million barrels of crude oil pass through the Strait of Hormuz every single day. That represents nearly 1/5 of all liquid petroleum consumed globally. Every tanker carrying oil from the Persian Gulf to Asia, Europe, or beyond must navigate these waters. And it's not just oil. Roughly 1/5 of the world's liquefied natural gas shipments also transit through Hormuz. This is why analysts and media outlets frequently describe it as the jugular vein of the global economy. Despite being located in the Middle East, the military presence in and around the strait is dominated by the United States. American carrier strike groups, guided missile cruisers, and destroyers are permanently stationed in both the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman. Washington officially justifies this deployment as protection for international shipping lanes, a service to the global community. But the reality is more complex. This military presence gives the United States extraordinary leverage. If political tensions escalate, or if Washington decides to restrict the flow of energy to a particular region, it has the military capability to enforce a blockade. And that capability is not theoretical. It's a tool of statecraft. Of course, the United States isn't the only player in this game. Iran, which controls the northern shore of the strait, has made its own position clear. In June 2025, the Iranian parliament passed a resolution affirming Tehran's right to close the strait under certain conditions, with final authority resting with the National Security Council. The message was unmistakable. If Iran feels threatened, it can turn off the tap. Now here's the question that keeps Chinese policymakers awake at night. What happens if that tap gets turned off? China's energy dilemma. China is the world's largest importer of crude oil. In 2024 alone, the country imported nearly 550 million tons. To put that in perspective, that's enough oil to fill more than 4 million Olympic-sized swimming pools. Of that massive total, 44% came from just 6 countries in the Persian Gulf region. That's over 240 million tons of oil flowing from the Middle East to China every year. Saudi Arabia leads the list, exporting roughly 78 million tons to China in 2024. Iraq comes second, with close to 65 million tons. The United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Oman, and Qatar round out the group. But here's the vulnerability. Nearly all of that oil must pass through the Strait of Hormuz to reach China. If that passage were closed, whether by military conflict, political crisis, or deliberate blockade, the consequences for China would be immediate and severe. Saudi crude, Iraqi oil, Emirati exports, Qatari natural gas, all of it would be cut off. China does maintain strategic petroleum reserves, but those reserves would last only a few months under normal consumption. Once depleted, Beijing would be forced to turn to alternative suppliers, likely paying significantly higher prices in a market that would be thrown into chaos. Global oil prices would skyrocket, supply chains would buckle, industrial production would slow, the economic and political costs would be staggering. Now, it's true that Chinese tankers aren't entirely dependent on the Strait of Hormuz. There is an alternative, sailing around the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa. But that detour adds nearly 10,000 kilometers to the journey and extends transit time by at least 2 to 3 weeks. Even if oil could still reach China, the costs would surge. Shipping fees, insurance premiums, and fuel consumption would all rise dramatically. And in a crisis, every day matters. This is the paradox at the heart of China's rise. Despite becoming an economic superpower, despite building the world's largest navy, despite expanding its influence across continents, China remains profoundly vulnerable to a choke point it does not control. Or at least, it was vulnerable. Because after more than a decade of quiet, patient work, China has built something that changes the equation entirely. The railway that took 12 years to build. The story of the China-Iran Railway begins in 2013, when Beijing unveiled one of the most ambitious infrastructure initiatives in modern history, the Belt and Road Initiative. The concept was straightforward but sweeping. China would invest hundreds of billions of dollars in roads, railways, ports, and pipelines across Asia, Africa, and Europe, creating a vast network of trade routes that would connect the eastern edge of the continent to the western edge, and beyond. Iran, sitting at the geographic crossroads of the Eurasian landmass, was a natural partner. Chinese and Iranian officials began discussions almost immediately on how to link their rail systems. The first test run took place in 2016. A train traveled approximately 10,400 kilometers from China to Iran, taking 18 days to complete the journey. It was a symbolic achievement, a proof of concept, but it wasn't yet operational. The infrastructure wasn't ready. The logistics weren't in place. The political will hadn't fully materialized. The real breakthrough came 5 years later, in 2021. That year, China and Iran signed a sweeping 25-year cooperation agreement valued at up to $400 billion. The deal covered energy, infrastructure, telecommunications, and trade. Buried within it was a commitment to complete the China-Iran Railway. Over the following years, officials from China, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, and Iran held a series of technical meetings to resolve one of the most persistent obstacles: incompatible track gauges. Different countries use different railway standards, which means trains can't always cross borders seamlessly. Solving this required coordination, investment, and compromise. By June 2024, Iran had completed a critical section of track, the Rasht-Caspian Railway, linking its own network to Turkmenistan's. This was the missing piece. And then, on May 24, 2025, the railway officially opened for full operation. The route stretches over 10,000 kilometers. It begins in Xi'an, one of China's ancient capital cities and a major logistics hub. From there, it crosses into Kazakhstan, traverses the deserts and steppes of Central Asia, passes through Turkmenistan, and finally enters Iran, terminating at the Apron Dry Port. In June 2025, the first commercial freight train made the journey in just 15 days. 2 weeks later, it returned to China loaded with 50,000 barrels of Iranian crude oil. The implications of this are hard to overstate. So, let's start with, well, the most obvious benefit: speed and security. Under the traditional model, Iranian oil tankers sailing to China would take between 30 and 40 days to complete the journey. They would have to navigate the Strait of Hormuz, cross the Arabian Sea, pass through the Strait of Malacca, another critical choke point, and then sail north along the Chinese coast. But the railway, it cuts that time in half. We're talking 15 days, door to door. But it's not just about speed, it's about certainty. Maritime shipping is subject to weather delays, piracy risks, and, all kinds of geopolitical disruptions. A train traveling overland faces none of these challenges. The route is predictable, the delivery window is reliable, and most importantly, it's secure. According to current plans, Iran can transport up to 600,000 tons of oil to China every month via this railway. And Chinese officials have indicated they intend to scale that up to 1 million tons in the near future. For Iran, this is honestly transformative. For years, Tehran has struggled under waves of U.S. sanctions that have made it nearly impossible to sell oil on international markets. Western banks won't touch Iranian transactions. Shipping companies avoid Iranian ports. Even countries willing to buy Iranian oil often hesitate because of fear of secondary sanctions. But the railway changes the game. It provides a physical, sanctions-proof route for Iranian oil to reach one of the world's largest markets. And then there's the financial dimension. Traditionally, nearly all global oil trade is settled in U.S. dollars. This gives Washington enormous power. Through the SWIFT financial messaging system, the United States can monitor, influence, and even block transactions. If a country falls out of favor with Washington, it can be cut off from the global financial system. But in the trade flowing along the China-Iran railway, over 80% of transactions are settled in Chinese yuan and Iranian rials. No dollars, no SWIFT, no American oversight. For Iran, this represents the first time in decades that it has been able to conduct large-scale energy trade using its own currency and physical infrastructure, completely independent of Western financial systems. For China, it's a significant step toward reducing dependence on the dollar and energy markets. And for the United States, it's a direct challenge to one of the pillars of its global influence. Beyond Iran, the bigger vision. But the China-Iran railway is not the endgame. It's just the beginning of something much larger. According to plans already in motion, the railway will branch in two directions once it reaches Iran. The first branch will extend south toward the Persian Gulf. This would allow the railway to connect with the transportation networks of Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates, three of the world's largest oil and gas producers. Imagine a future where Saudi oil doesn't need to be loaded onto tankers at all. It could simply be placed on trains and sent directly to China overland. The second branch will extend west, crossing through Iran into Turkey, and eventually connecting to the European rail network. This route could, in time, serve as an alternative to the Suez Canal and the Red Sea shipping lane, offering a faster and more secure corridor for trade between Asia and Europe. If fully realized, this network would span nearly 10 countries, creating a single integrated system stretching from the Pacific coast of China to the Atlantic shores of Europe. Trade between these regions would become faster, cheaper, and less vulnerable to disruption. This is the vision behind the Belt and Road Initiative, a world where overland connectivity rivals, and in some cases surpasses, maritime dominance. And China isn't stopping there. The two-ocean railway, South America's turn. While the China-Iran railway reshapes Eurasia, another megaproject is quietly taking shape on the other side of the world. China and Brazil have announced plans to build a transcontinental railway across South America. The route would connect Chancay, a port on Peru's Pacific coast, with the port of Ilhéus on Brazil's Atlantic coast. The railway would span approximately 6,500 kilometers, crossing the Andes Mountains and the Amazon rainforest. Once completed, this two-ocean railway would fundamentally alter trade flows in South America. Currently, goods traveling between the Pacific and Atlantic coasts of the continent must either be shipped around Cape Horn or pass through the Panama Canal, a route controlled by the United States through much of the 20th century. The railway would eliminate that dependency entirely. Brazilian soybeans, Chilean copper, Peruvian minerals, all of it could move across the continent by rail, reaching Asian markets faster and more cheaply than ever before. For China, it would open a direct land bridge to South America's resource-rich interior. For South American nations, it would reduce dependence on North American infrastructure and financial systems. And for the United States, it would represent yet another crack in the architecture of dominance that Washington has relied upon since the end of World War II. The unraveling of naval hegemony. For most of the past century, global power has been synonymous with naval power. The British Empire was built on the Royal Navy's ability to control sea lanes from London to Calcutta. American dominance in the post-war era was founded on a network of aircraft carriers, overseas bases, and alliances that gave Washington unparalleled control over the world's oceans. Whoever controlled the choke points, the Strait of Hormuz, the Strait of Malacca, the Suez Canal, the Panama Canal, controlled global commerce. But the rise of overland mega-infrastructure is starting to change that calculus. Railways don't pass through choke points. They don't require naval escorts. They can't be blockaded by aircraft carriers. They operate on land, where traditional naval power has little reach. This doesn't mean that navies are obsolete. Far from it. Maritime trade will remain critically important for decades to come. But what is shifting is the balance of leverage. Countries that were once entirely dependent on sea routes now have alternatives. And alternatives mean choices. Choices mean negotiating power. And negotiating power means a redistribution of influence. China is not trying to replace the global maritime system. It's trying to build a parallel system, one that it controls, one that reduces its vulnerabilities, and one that offers other nations a way to trade and grow without passing through American-dominated choke points. What comes next? The opening of the China-Iran Railway is not the end of a project. It's the beginning of a new era in how goods, energy, and influence move across the planet. Over the coming years, we'll likely see further expansions, more rail links, more dry ports, more bilateral agreements that bypass traditional financial systems, more countries joining China's infrastructure network because it offers them something they need: access, security, and sovereignty. The United States will not sit idly by. Washington still commands the most powerful navy in history. It still controls critical financial infrastructure. It still has alliances spanning the globe. But the rules of the game are shifting, and the outcome is far from certain. What's clear is this: the world is moving toward a more multipolar system, where power is less concentrated and more distributed, where alternatives exist to the structures that have dominated for generations, where a railway across Central Asia can quietly rewrite the logic of global strategy. The train that left Xi'an in May 2025 wasn't just carrying cargo, it was carrying a message. The age of unchallenged maritime dominance may be coming to an end, and the future of global power may be written not on the open ocean, but on 10,000 kilometers of steel track stretching across the heart of Eurasia. What do you think this means for the future of global trade and geopolitics? Let us know in the comments below. And if you found this analysis valuable, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next deep dive into the forces reshaping our world.